The unified Galactic Council prided itself on three things: meticulous bureaucracy, unnecessarily complex architecture, and an absolute obsession with weapons protocols. The central chamber of the Council headquarters on Proxima Centauri Station was a marvel of engineering that seemed designed primarily to make everyone feel simultaneously impressed and insignificant, much like the Council's legislative process. Another day, another opportunity to watch advanced civilizations squabble like toddlers fighting over the last nutrient cube, muttered Ambassador Chen as he straightened his formal diplomatic uniform. The human delegation had arrived early, as was their custom, partly out of respect for protocol, and partly because it annoyed the hell out of the Arcturian representatives. The human guards stood at attention behind the delegation, their posture perfect, their expressions neutral, and most notably, their holsters empty. No plasma rifles, no pulse disruptors, not even a ceremonial blade. Just 6 humans in crisp black uniforms, hands clasped behind their backs, looking about as threatening as furniture. This peculiarity had been the subject of much discussion, speculation, and occasional mockery throughout the galactic diplomatic community for the 15 years since humans had joined the Council. Every other species came armed to the teeth, or whatever passed for teeth in their respective physiologies. The Draconian guards bristled with venomous spines and carried ceremonial acid projectors. The Veltraxian security detail wore exoskeletons that could generate force fields capable of vaporizing a small moon. Even the peaceful Altarians, who evolved from herbivorous herd creatures, had guards equipped with sonic disruptors that could liquefy internal organs at 30 paces. Yet here stood the humans, biological specimens from a backwater planet that had somehow managed faster-than-light travel without destroying themselves, with guards who carried nothing more threatening than a communication device. Commander Jackson, head of the human security detail, had been doing this job for 12 years. He'd witnessed 17 assassination attempts, 12 diplomatic incidents classified as potentially extinction level, and one particularly memorable occasion when the Rigelian ambassador had too much fermented crystal sap and tried to mate with a decorative plant. Through it all, he and his team had never once drawn a weapon, mainly because they didn't have any to draw. "Status report," he subvocalized, the implant at his larynx transmitting to the units embedded in his team's inner ears. "All clear, Commander," came the synchronized response from his 5 team members spread throughout the chamber. "Though the Arcturian Third Undersecretary keeps glaring at Ambassador Chen." Jackson suppressed a smile. "That's just how their facial muscles work. They're always glaring." "No, sir, this is definitely personal. Remember the chess incident?" "Ah, yes, the chess incident." The ambassador had taught the Arcturian delegation how to play chess during last cycle's trade negotiations. The game had spread like wildfire through their ranks, becoming something of an obsession, to the point where their productivity had dropped by 30%. Their High Council had been forced to ban the game entirely, leading to what historians now referred to as the Knights' Rebellion. Today's meeting was particularly tense. The expansion rights to the Cygnus Arm were up for discussion, and no fewer than 7 species had legitimate claims. The humans, being newcomers, had the weakest position but somehow the strongest negotiating tactics. Something about evolving on a planet where everything was constantly trying to kill you apparently honed one's diplomatic skills. Ambassador Chen approached the central podium, nodding respectfully to each delegation. "Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Council, honored guests and fellow sentients, we gather today to discuss the future of the Cygnus Arm Expansion Initiative." The chamber hummed with translation devices, diplomatic aides whispering to their superiors, and the occasional hiss or click that passed for polite appreciation in various cultures. "Before we begin," continued Chen, "I would like to express humanity's gratitude for the Council's patience as we navigate our first major territorial negotiation. As the newest members of this esteemed body, we recognize our position comes with both limitations and opportunities." The Arcturian representative chittered something that the translation matrix rendered as, "particularly the limitations," earning a ripple of amused trills from the more predatory species in attendance. Chen smiled. that uniquely human expression that managed to convey both friendliness and a hint of threat. Indeed, esteemed Arcturian, we humans are quite familiar with limitations. Our homeworld has taught us that limitations often breed the most creative solutions. Jackson shifted his weight slightly, maintaining his perfect posture while scanning the room. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place it. The hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. An evolutionary holdover from when humans were prey animals that had saved his life more times than he cared to admit. Perimeter check, he subvocalized to his team. Something's not right. As the diplomatic proceedings droned on, building toward what promised to be a contentious vote, the guards discreetly increased their vigilance. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. To a trained eye, particularly a human one, the subtle shift in stance, the slightly widened field of vision, and the almost imperceptible tension in their muscles signaled that the human guards had gone from alert to combat ready, all without a single weapon in sight. Part 2. The Incident. The council chamber had reached that peculiar state of diplomatic tension where everyone was shouting without raising their voices. Representatives from 7 different species were finding increasingly creative ways to say absolutely not to each other's proposals, while maintaining the veneer of civility that prevented the activation of the chamber's automatic defense systems. Perhaps, suggested the Veltraxian delegate, their voice modulator set to soothing condescension, our human colleagues would be satisfied with exploration rights to the outer systems. After all, they're still adapting to interstellar navigation. This was diplomatic code for go play in the empty corner of space while the adults handle the important stuff. Ambassador Chin's smile remained fixed, but those who knew humans well could detect the dangerous glint in his eyes. We appreciate the Veltrakian delegation's concern for our navigational capabilities, Chen replied. However, I should note that it was a human vessel that charted the path through the CT radiation belt that your colony ships now use. Adaptation is something of a specialty for our species. The Arcturian representative made a sound like gravel in a blender, their version of derisive laughter. Adaptation! The species that can't survive without temperature control and requires constant hydration speaks of adaptation. Perhaps we should discuss the human delegation's most puzzling adaptation: ceremonial guards who carry no weapons. One might question the utility. Jackson maintained his perfect stillness, though internally he was rolling his eyes. This particular jab came up at least once per diplomatic cycle. Usually it was just annoying. Today, with his instincts screaming that something was wrong, it felt like a deliberate distraction. Movement at the service entrance, came the whispered report from Lieutenant Hayes, positioned at the chamber's far side. Council security is checking credentials, but something seems off about their posture. Jackson's eyes flicked to the entrance in question. The 2 Draconian security officers were indeed engaged with someone just outside the door, their normally rigid posture showing subtle signs of agitation. To anyone else, it would appear to be a routine security check. To a human trained to read body language across species, it looked like suppressed panic. Maintain positions but be ready to move, Jackson ordered. Hayes, casual approach to that entrance. Diplomatic inquiry only. As Hayes began a leisurely stroll toward the service entrance, Ambassador Chen was delivering a carefully crafted response to the Arcturian's taunt. The absence of weapons among our guards is not an adaptation but a choice, esteemed Arcturian. Humans have a long history of finding that tools often become crutches. We prefer our security personnel to rely on their most effective assets, their training, their judgment, and their inherent capabilities. The Arcturian's translator rendered a sound that approximated a snort. Poetic but hardly practical in galactic diplomacy, where the interruption came not from Chen, but from the service entrance, where Hayes had just reached the Draconian guards. There was a flash of light, a sound like thunder contained in a small room, and suddenly, the 2 Draconian guards were down, their scales smoking. Hayes was thrown back several meters, sliding across the polished floor. Chaos erupted instantly. Various species guards drew weapons, delegates dove for cover, and the chamber's defensive systems activated with a whine of charging capacitors. Through the service entrance poured 6 figures in environmental suits that obscured their species. They moved with military precision, each carrying what appeared to be modified Corvian disruptor rifles, weapons that were supposed to be restricted to frontier defense forces. "Weapons free, neutralize all security and delegates," ordered the lead figure, their voice distorted by their suit's communication system. "Priority targets are the human and Veltraxian ambassadors." The council chamber erupted in weapons fire, screams, and the sound of expensive furniture being destroyed. Force fields snapped into place around some of the more prepared delegations, while others scrambled for cover behind overturned tables and decorative columns. And in the middle of it all, the human guards, still conspicuously unarmed, moved with startling speed and purpose. "Hey, status?" Jackson called as he vaulted over the human delegation's table, pushing Ambassador Chen down into cover. "Stunned but functional," came the response. "Those are Corvian disruptors, but they've been modified. Reduced power, increased rate of fire. They're not trying to kill everyone," Jackson realized. "They want hostages." Across the chamber, the other human guards had deployed to defensive positions, their movements a blur compared to the other species, while the armed security forces of various delegations engaged in firefights with the attackers. The humans were moving delegates to safer positions, creating improvised barricades, and generally behaving as if the lack of weapons was an inconvenience rather than a handicap. "Carrington, Hayes, with me," Jackson ordered. "We're going to flank them through the service corridor. Reynolds, Patel, Washington. Hold position and protect the delegates. Priority is Ambassador Chen, but protect everyone you can." "Sir," Patel replied. "One of the attackers is moving toward the environmental controls. They might be trying to vent the atmosphere." "Understood. Change of plans. Patel, intercept that one. The rest of you, execute as ordered." Without waiting for confirmation, Jackson sprinted toward a seemingly decorative wall panel, pressed a specific sequence of points, and disappeared through a hidden maintenance passage that theoretically only Council security should have known about. The attackers, who had been methodically working their way through the chamber's defenses, suddenly found themselves dealing with a new problem. Humans who moved too fast, hit too hard, and seemed to anticipate their tactics. One attacker, separated from the group, was approaching the environmental control panel when a blur of motion caught their peripheral vision. They turned, weapon raised, only to find it knocked from their grasp by a flying table leg that Patel had broken off and thrown with alarming accuracy. Before they could process this development, Patel had closed the distance and delivered a strike to the attacker's midsection that folded them despite their protective suit. A follow-up blow to what Patel guessed was the helmet's visual sensor effectively blinded them. Across the chamber, Reynolds had commandeered a decorative metal staff from a wall display and was using it with alarming efficiency to deflect energy blasts away from the huddled delegates. Washington had somehow acquired a ceremonial blade from the Rigelian delegation and was using it to cut through power conduits, strategically darkening sections of the chamber to create confusion among the attackers. And through the service corridor, Jackson, Carrington, and Hayes were moving like shadows, preparing to strike the attackers from behind. Part 3. The Revelation. The lead attacker was beginning to realize that their carefully planned operation was falling apart, though they couldn't quite understand why. Their intelligence had been clear. The human delegation's guards were unarmed, making them the perfect initial target to demoralize the others. Yet somehow, these unarmed humans were proving more problematic than the heavily armed Draconian and Veltraxian security forces. "Group up and watch your flanks," the leader ordered. "Something's not right with the humans." "What do you mean, not right?" demanded one of the other attackers. "They have no weapons." "And yet 3 of our team are down," the leader snapped back. "Form a defensive perimeter. We still have the Arcturian ambassador. We can salvage this operation." The remaining attackers moved into position around their leader, who was now holding a disruptor to the Arcturian ambassador's primary breathing orifice. The room had descended into an uneasy standoff, with various security forces holding position behind cover, unwilling to risk the ambassador's life. "Your attention, please," announced the lead attacker. We represent the Free Systems Coalition. We demand the immediate cessation of all Cygnus arm colonization efforts and the release of political prisoners held on Rigel Prime. You have 1 standard hour to comply or we will execute hostages, starting with the Arcturian ambassador. Ambassador Chen, who had been quietly observing from behind a fallen column, glanced at Washington and nodded slightly. Washington returned the nod and began moving slowly along the perimeter of the room, keeping to the shadows. The Free Systems Coalition was disbanded 3 cycles ago, called out the draconian representative. Who are you really? The lead attacker's grip tightened on their weapon. The coalition was never disbanded. It merely went underground after the Rigelian betrayal. Now, we return to claim justice. While this exchange continued, Jackson, Hayes, and Carrington had positioned themselves at 3 different entry points to the main chamber, having navigated the service corridors with suspicious familiarity. On my mark, Jackson subvocalized. 3, 2, 1. What happened next would be reviewed countless times in security briefings across the galaxy for years to come. The 3 humans burst into the chamber simultaneously from different directions, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for unaugmented biological entities. Hayes grabbed a decorative lighting fixture from the wall and flung it like a spear, striking one attacker's weapon with enough force to shatter its power cell. Carrington somersaulted across the floor, coming up with a piece of broken furniture that she used to sweep the legs out from under 2 more attackers, and Jackson simply ran, faster than many species believed possible, directly at the leader holding the Arcturian ambassador hostage. The leader fired their disruptor, but Jackson was already changing direction, the beam missing him by millimeters. In the same motion, Jackson grabbed a fallen drink container from a delegate's table and hurled it with frightening accuracy, striking the leader's helmet with enough force to crack its visual sensor. Temporarily blinded, the leader's grip on the Arcturian loosened, just enough for the ambassador to pull away. Jackson closed the distance in seconds, delivering a precise strike to what he estimated was a nerve cluster in the attacker's suit. The leader went down, and Jackson was on them instantly, disarming them with a technique that looked deceptively simple, but required an understanding of leverage that few species possessed. Across the chamber, the other human guards were similarly engaged. Patel had fashioned a makeshift bola from communication cables and was using it to entangle another attacker. Reynolds had somehow adapted the metal staff to conduct electricity from an exposed power conduit, creating an improvised shock weapon. Washington, who had circled around during the distraction, dropped from an overhead fixture directly onto the final attacker, taking them down with nothing more than body weight and the precise application of force to vulnerable joints. In less than 30 seconds, all 6 attackers were neutralized, disarmed and restrained using a combination of furniture parts, clothing items, and, in one particularly creative case, decorative fountain tubing. The chamber fell silent as the delegates and their armed guards stared in disbelief at the human security team, who were now calmly checking the restraints on the attackers and administering first aid to injured delegates. "Are you injured, Ambassador?" Jackson asked the Arcturian representative, who was still frozen in shock. "No," the translator rendered after a moment. "How did you, without weapons?" Jackson shrugged. As Ambassador Chen mentioned, humans prefer not to rely on tools that can be taken away or malfunction. We find our natural abilities more than sufficient for most situations. The Veltraxian security chief approached, his massive exoskeleton whirring. "That was unexpected. Your speed and strength exceed our intelligence reports on human capabilities." "Intelligence reports are often based on averages," Jackson replied diplomatically. "Security personnel tend to be statistical outliers." Ambassador Chen, now emerging from cover, straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should call a brief recess to address the security breach before continuing our discussions on the Cygnus Arm expansion." The council representatives, still processing what they had witnessed, could only nod in agreement. Part 4. The Aftermath. "Let me get this straight," said the Draconian High Commander, his scales still bristling with agitation 2 hours after the attack. "Your guards intentionally carry no weapons as a matter of policy?" This wasn't some bizarre cultural ritual or diplomatic posturing. The council had reconvened in a smaller, more secure chamber while the main hall was being repaired, and the attackers, now revealed to be a splinter faction of Rigelian extremists, were being processed by council security. Ambassador Chen nodded. That is correct, High Commander. Human security doctrine evolved over centuries of conflict on our homeworld. We discovered that over-reliance on weapons often created vulnerabilities rather than eliminating them. The Valtraxian representative's sensory appendages twitched in what translated as deep skepticism. But surely against superior weaponry. With respect, Commander Jackson interjected, weapons are predictable. They have specific functions, limitations, and failure points. A trained human combatant can adapt to changing circumstances in ways that weapon systems cannot. But the speed, chittered the Arcturian ambassador, who had been unusually quiet since being rescued. The strength. Our scientific exchange data indicates humans are mid-tier physical specimens at best. Jackson exchanged a glance with Ambassador Chen, who nodded slightly. Perhaps a brief biology lesson is in order, Jackson suggested. Humans evolved on a high-gravity world with extreme environmental variations. Our musculature and skeletal structure reflect this. While our baseline strength isn't remarkable by galactic standards, we have a unique ability to utilize our full strength in crisis situations. Hysterical strength, added Lieutenant Hayes, who had joined the debriefing session. Most species regulate their physical output to prevent self-injury. Humans can temporarily override these limitations. As for speed, continued Jackson, humans are persistence predators. We're not the fastest sprinters, but we evolved to chase prey to exhaustion. Our cardiovascular system, thermal regulation, and psychology are all optimized for sustained effort rather than brief bursts. The Draconian High Commander's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of intense thought. So, when your guards appear to be standing motionless, they're conserving energy, confirmed Jackson, ready to sustain maximum output when needed. The Altarian representative, whose species was known for their philosophical bent, leaned forward. But this doesn't explain the lack of weapons. Your natural capabilities are impressive, but surely they would be enhanced by appropriate tools. Ambassador Chen smiled. There's a human saying, to a hammer everything looks like a nail. Weapons predispose one to certain solutions, certain angles of approach. Our security philosophy prioritizes adaptability above all else. Additionally, added Jackson, there's a psychological component. When you carry a weapon, you create distance between yourself and potential threats. You begin thinking in terms of engagement ranges and firing solutions. Without weapons, we're forced to be more present, more aware of our surroundings and the subtle cues that often precede violence. The council members exchanged looks of varying degrees of comprehension and disbelief. But surely, pressed the Valtrachian, today's events have demonstrated the limitations of this approach. The attackers were armed with disruptor rifles. And yet, Chen replied gently, they were neutralized without a single shot fired by our team. No collateral damage, no delegate casualties. Compare that to the weapon discharges from the other security forces, which resulted in 17 instances of structural damage and 3 minor injuries to bystanders. The chamber fell silent as the representatives processed this information. Finally, the Arcturian ambassador spoke, their translator struggling to convey the complex emotional overtones in their speech. I have served on this council for 7 cycles, they began. In that time, I have treated the human delegation with what I now recognize as unwarranted condescension. Today, I owe my life to Commander Jackson's quick thinking and extraordinary capabilities. Perhaps there is more wisdom in the human approach than I had previously acknowledged. Ambassador Chen inclined his head in acknowledgement. We all have much to learn from each other, esteemed Arcturian. That is the foundation of this council. The Draconian High Commander's scales had finally settled into their normal pattern. I believe we have 2 matters to address. First, a formal commendation for the human security team, whose actions today prevented what could have been a diplomatic catastrophe. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. And second, continued the High Commander, perhaps we should reconsider the Cygnus Arm expansion proposal with fresh perspective. The humans have demonstrated qualities today that might be valuable in navigating the challenges of that region. Ambassador Chen's expression remained neutral, but those who knew humans well might have detected the slight crinkle around his eyes that indicated satisfaction. The human delegation would be honored to continue those discussions, Chen replied. But perhaps we could address the matter of chess restrictions for the Arcturian delegation first. I believe today's events have demonstrated that sometimes the most effective strategies involve thinking beyond conventional weapons. The Arcturian representative made a sound that the translator struggled with momentarily before rendering as laughter. Perhaps, they conceded, there is something to be said for unconventional approaches. As the council session resumed, the human security team returned to their positions around the chamber, once again standing at perfect attention, hands clasped behind their backs. No weapons in sight. But the way the other species representatives and security forces looked at them had changed. Where once there had been dismissal or mild curiosity, now there was something new. Respect tinged with the faintest hint of apprehension, and Commander Jackson, maintaining his perfect professional demeanor, couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. The best weapon, after all, had always been the one no one sees coming, even when it's standing right in front of them, hiding in plain sight. In the grand theater of galactic politics, where every species came armed with their most impressive technological terrors, humanity had made its point with nothing but flesh, bone, and the culmination of a brutal evolutionary history that had forged them into something the galaxy was only beginning to understand. No weapons necessary. In the months following what became known as the Council incident, the human approach to security underwent intense scrutiny throughout the galaxy. Military academies on dozens of worlds added new courses, human combat philosophy, and weaponless engagement theory. The irony wasn't lost on Ambassador Chen that these courses often involved extensive weapons training. The Cygnus Arm negotiations concluded with an unprecedented agreement: joint colonization rights shared between humans, Arcturians, and Veltraxians, with humans taking point on security operations. The other species initially protested, until diplomatic transcripts revealed it had been the Arcturian ambassador who suggested the arrangement. They stopped a heavily armed attack with nothing but quick thinking and whatever they could grab, the Arcturian had argued. Imagine what they could accomplish with actual resources. Commander Jackson found himself reluctantly accepting a ceremonial position as advisor to the Council's security forces, though he insisted on maintaining operational command of the human detail. The moment we start relying on plasma rifles is the moment we start thinking like everyone else, he told his team during training. And our advantage has always been that we don't. The Regelian extremists were tried and sentenced to rehabilitation, though their testimony revealed a disturbing detail. They had specifically targeted the humans first, precisely because intelligence indicated they were unarmed. The plan had been to neutralize the seemingly weakest security force to demoralize the others. A predictable strategy, Chen remarked when informed. That's the problem with weapons. They don't just shape how you fight, they shape how you think. On Earth, the diplomatic report was received with quiet satisfaction. The aging general, who had first proposed the no-weapons policy decades earlier, initially met with ridicule, allowed himself a small smile when he read Jackson's account. Across the galaxy, the various species of the Council continued their ancient traditions of ceremonial weapons and impressive armaments. But now, they watched the humans with new eyes, finally understanding the oldest lesson of Earth's long history of conflict. The most dangerous predator isn't the one with the sharpest claws or the deadliest venom. It's the one that makes you believe it isn't a predator at all.